the government is releasing the comprehensive review of the legal framework of the national intelligence community, known as the Richardson Review, and we're also simultaneously releasing the government response to that review. So I might start by thanking Dennis Richardson for his quite remarkable work in putting this review together and for his team. Obviously, Dennis was a former Secretary of Defence of DFAT, Ambassador to the United States and Director General of ASIO, so he was uniquely suited and qualified to conduct this review. It is a colossal piece of work and it will obviously take all of those assembled some time to fully digest it, but what I intended to do today is just give as brief a summary as I can and then obviously open for questions. As noted in the House yesterday, there's no greater priority for our government than keeping Australians safe, and our national intelligence community is obviously central to that mission. They need to be properly resourced. They also need to be furnished with the appropriate legislative tools, and that's been a core focus of our government. And the threat environment has changed remarkably since 2001 and is changing very rapidly at the moment. And if you look back to the 9/11 attacks in 2001, since that point in time, parliaments under various governments have passed collectively more than 124 acts amending the national intelligence community's legislative framework. So I think that across both sides of politics there's not been a complacency in ensuring that the legislative tools are there. However, it is a constant process of stress testing the legislative and structural framework to make sure that it's fit for purpose. And the pinnacle of that stress testing process is this Richardson Review. In May 2018, the government commissioned Dennis Richardson to conduct the comprehensive review of the legal framework governing the national intelligence community. That, in fact, was itself a recommendation of the 2017 Independent Intelligence Review. This is the most significant review into the national intelligence community since the Hope Royal Commissions in the 1970s and 1980s. And like the Hope reports, this report is meant to be a reference guide for national security and intelligence policy and lawmakers for the next generation of the operation of the intelligence community. The 18-month review process was exhaustive. Dennis was supported by a large multi-agency review team of 21 staff and engaged from everyone across the Commonwealth, state and territory agencies, international partners, civil society and the public to form his recommendations. So there is a 1,600-page classified report which contains 203 recommendations. That report was delivered to the Commonwealth late in December of 2019. There then went, over many months, a process of creating a carefully declassified report, and that is the report that the government is releasing today. The unclassified report is itself 1,300 pages and it sets out 190 recommendations. So there were 203 recommendations in full, 13 of those are classified recommendations. The other 190 appear in the declassified report that's being released today. Only 4 of the recommendations, the 190 public recommendations, are not agreed to by government, only 4. The 13 classified recommendations, none of those were disagreed to, but obviously they're recommendations that I can't speak to in detail here, but I will speak in some detail around the 190 recommendations, of which 186 were either agreed or agreed in part. Just also today we are releasing the government's response to the unclassified version of the report. That response itself is 52 pages long. And again, I'd stress that as outlined in that response, the government has agreed either in full or principle or in part to 186 of the 190 public recommendations. The 1,300 pages of the declassified report we're releasing today go across 4 volumes, and each of the volumes covers a thematic issue. The first is the foundations and principles and the control, coordination and cooperation of our intelligence community. There are 28 recommendations arising from that volume. The second is the issues of authorisations, immunities and electronic surveillance. There are 106 recommendations in that volume. The third is information technology powers and oversights. There are 49 recommendations. And the fourth is accountability and transparency, where there are 20 recommendations. And before moving on to make some comment about specific recommendations, I think it's worth touching on some of the key important thematic conclusions of the report. And there were essentially three of those. The first was that the report found that the key principles that underpin Australia's intelligence legislation are sound and that they are enduring, which is to say that we can still rely on those basic principles. They are principles which should continue to inform the roles, responsibilities and powers of the national intelligence community. And these principles are foundational. They are principles such as the distinction between foreign intelligence and security intelligence, the distinction between onshore versus the offshore activities of our intelligence community, and the distinctions that we make and draw between the protections for Australians versus non-Australians or non-citizens. The second basic finding, if I can put it that way, of the Richardson Review is that the legislative framework, whilst it's very complicated, when it's viewed as a whole, it has been well maintained and is largely fit for purpose. So it's operationally fit for purpose. But the report acknowledges that the active role of successive governments of parliaments have helped, while they have helped the legislative environment keep pace, there are clearly some changes that will need to be made in the coming months and years. The third matter of principle is the report notes that our intelligence community, and this is a very exhaustive review, it notes that our intelligence community is of the highest professional character and standards, that they operate with the highest degrees of professionalism, and that they have a very strong commitment and track record from exercising all of their powers and their operations and their functions inside the proper limits of the relevant governing law.